Alright, hello and welcome back to our reading of Stave 4 of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. In today's extract we are going to be looking at the future of Tiny Tim. As always, I'll read the extract first and then we will start having a look at some key lines and key ideas that you need to know to understand this piece of the text. The timings will be below this video, and please remember you only need to focus your annotation if you're copying notes into your books on the ones that are in bold. Okay. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The colour hurts my eyes," she said. "The colour? Ah, poor Tiny Tim!" "Oh, they're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time." "Past it, rather," Peter answered, shutting up his book. "But I think he has walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, Mother." They were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed." "And so have I," cried Peter, "often." "And so have I," exclaimed another. So had all. "But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work, "and his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there is your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid, each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday." "My little, little child," cried Bob. "My little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. "On which," said Bob, "for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you have ever heard, I told him. "I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit," he said, "and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know." "Knew what, my dear?" "Why, that you were a good wife," replied Bob. "Everybody knows that," said Peter. "Very well observed, my boy," cried Bob. "I hope they do." "Heartily sorry," he said, "for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way," he said, giving me his card, "that's where I live. Pray come to me." "Now, it wasn't," cried Bob, "for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim, and felt with us." "I'm sure he's a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "You would be sure of it, my dear," returned Bob, "if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation." "Only hear that, Peter," said Mrs. Cratchit. "And then," cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself." "Get along with you," retorted Peter, grinning. "It's just as likely as not," said Bob. "One of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, or this first parting that there was among us?" "Never, father," cried they all. "And I know," said Bob, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it." "No, never, father," they all cried again. "I am very happy," said little Bob. "I am very happy." Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. "Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God." Okay, so a really emotionally significant scene within the novel, this one, in which we learn that in the future, which remember can yet be changed by Scrooge, in this version of the future, Tiny Tim has died, and it's implied that Tim has died because of the poor situation of the Cratchits, because they don't have enough money in order to properly look after him, and they haven't anyone to give them charity to help Tiny Tim to live longer. So let's have a little look then through some key annotations, and we'll think about how Dickens presents the Cratchits here, and in particular how different they seem in this part of the text to when they were first presented on Christmas Day in Stave 3. So the first thing that we notice is that they're described as quiet, very quiet. And let's just contrast Dickens' emphasis of the house's quiet atmosphere with its portrayal in Stave 3, remember when the Cratchits are celebrating Christmas. So Tiny Tim's death has utterly changed the family. They've been robbed of their joy and are grieving deeply. Sorry, that should say their joy, not tear joy. So we see that if you think about the way that their household was presented in Stave 3, the young Cratchits were running around, they were all really noisy. You had Mrs. Cratchit coming out in her twice-turned dress, and they were, all of them, frantically preparing the Christmas meal, waiting for Bob and Martha to come home. So there was real liveliness and excitement and celebration. And remember, when the Christmas meal is brought out, they all cheer, and even Tiny Tim is there banging his knife and fork on the table in happiness. But here, the house has been brought down to this solemn, quiet, almost silent atmosphere, and it suggests that the joy that this family had in each other's presence has been permanently altered. It's a much sadder situation. In this scene, Peter is reading from the Bible, and he took a child and set him in the midst of them. So these are the words that Scrooge hears when he first comes into the house, but he doesn't immediately understand their significance. So Peter's reading from the Bible, perhaps as a way of providing solace, solace meaning some comfort in a very distressing time, to his family. And it's important as well, the particular passage that he's reading from, because this little section of the Bible comes from a story about Christ's love and respect for the humblest of children. Children like Tim, children who are religious and virtuous and good, but not necessarily of a wealthy background. So it's a scene that directly relates to the closeness of children to God. And that's particularly important when we think about how virtuous, how good, how religious, how faithful Tiny Tim was. It's quite significant that that's the passage that Peter's reading from, because he's clearly reading it to give some comfort to his family that Tim has gone to heaven. But it's nevertheless a very sad scene, and Mrs. Cratchit, as she's sewing, says the colour of the thread hurts her eyes. And again, contrast this with how she's depicted in Stave 3 when she comes out and she's just dressed in these bright ribbons that she's added to her dress that make a goodly show for sixpence. So Tim's death has taken away her love of colour and bright things. In the Cratchit home, everything is sombre, everything seems darker and quieter, suggesting again that joy and happiness has been drained away from them. But a moment later she says, "I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home." So her eyes have been strained from sewing by candlelight, but she doesn't want Bob to notice that her eyes are red because he'll think that she's been crying, and she doesn't want to look weak in front of him. So Dickens highlights Mrs. Cratchit's resilience, her sort of toughness, her determination to make the best of things, and her strength. She doesn't want Bob to see her distressed, and we might imagine that this is because it will only make him more unhappy to see her unhappy. She is managing to kind of hold things together for the benefit of the family. So instead she puts on that brave face, and this reminds us again of how she's depicted as being brave when she's wearing those ribbons in Stave 3. She's brave in ribbons, suggesting she's always looking for a way to focus on the positive aspects of life so that her family don't feel unhappy or miserable because of their situation. But the fact that she doesn't want her husband, she doesn't want Bob to see her unhappy, hints perhaps that Bob has taken Tiny Tim's death the hardest, that she's kind of protecting him in some ways from her own grief, because he won't be able to cope if he sees how unhappy his family are as well as him. She notes that it must be time for him to be almost arriving home, and Peter says he's running late, it's past his time to be home, and notes he has walked a little slower than he used these past few evenings. So since Tim's death, Bob's speed of walking home has slowed down. And let's just contrast that again with the depiction of him running home on Christmas Eve that we see in Stave 1, because he's so eager to see his family, he runs all the way back home. But now he's walking very slowly. This suggests that that weight of his grief is really weighing heavily on him. He's struggling as he's heading home. Okay. Mrs. Cratchit falters and she sort of pauses and hesitates as she says her next lines. She says, in a cheerful and steady voice that only faltered once, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And that sort of fragmented sentence there, that fragmented syntax, suggests that she's struggling to say Tiny Tim's name the first time. And this suggests she's still coming to terms with his death. It's only been a few days since he's passed away, and mentioning his name is still perhaps quite painful and quite an emotional thing for her to do. So again, this shows her emotional reaction to her son's death. As Bob comes home, all of the family kind of rush to see who's going to be the one to help him with his tea, which has been ready for him. So this shows how the family are all supporting Bob, knowing he's struggling to cope, and they want to show support and sympathy and their love for him as well. And this highlights the family's supportive and loving and kindly nature. Family is of the utmost importance to them, and even in the wake of this tragedy, all of them kind of gather around each other to show their love and care for one another. As Bob talks about having gone to visit Tiny Tim's grave, or the plot where he's going to be buried, he notes how green a place it is and says, you'll see it often. I promised that I would walk there on a Sunday. I promised him I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, my little child. So, as Bob is describing the plot where Tim's to be buried, he notes it's green, and we might think that this is evocative of heaven, this kind of idea of the Garden of Eden. It brings to mind these religious images of a green and lush place, and it's quite pleasing to think that this is where Tim is going to be laid to rest. It seems like a pleasant and relaxing and peaceful atmosphere. It's also notable that they're going to walk there every Sunday. Now, Sunday obviously is the day that families would traditionally go to church, so it's quite significant from a religious standpoint that that's when they're going to go and visit Tim's grave. So Dickens imbues Tiny Tim, he sort of inspires that character, he fills that character with a religious significance, almost as though he's a kind of saviour figure. And we know that Tiny Tim is a deeply religious boy. He's very, very faithful. He talks openly about his love of Christ, his love of God. So it's quite interesting that he's depicted, even in death, in this kind of beautiful and peaceful and religious setting. As Bob talks about visiting Tim, though, he starts to break down, and we have this repetition of my little child, my little child. And that repetition of little and child emphasises Tim's youth, his innocence, his vulnerability, his fragility as well. As Bob is saying, my little child, it makes him seem very precious, very small, and very, very loved. It really seems unjust, it seems unfair, it seems wrong that Tim has died, because it's causing such suffering to such a good and virtuous family. And in this part of the text, Scrooge is being shown, here is something awful that is going to happen as a direct result of the way that you treat those who are not as well off as you. Scrooge can see very clearly, if he changes his ways, he can avert this unpleasant fate. He can change this and prevent it from happening. Bob breaks down, begins sobbing, and then he goes upstairs where Tiny Tim's body has been laid. And in the Victorian era, it wasn't so strange as perhaps we might think it is now for a family to keep the body of the deceased in their home until it was ready to be buried. And we have this very peaceful atmosphere described around Tim's bedside. So the room has been lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. So it's gently lit and has these decorations there. And this use of light really symbolises religion. Again, it symbolises purity, and it emphasises Tim's kind and virtuous nature. Remember, all the way through the novel, light is symbolic of goodness and kindness, and those are obviously qualities that are really important to our understanding of Tiny Tim's character. It's also interesting that there are Christmas decorations in the room, and we know from Stave 3 how much Tiny Tim adores and loves Christmas because it is a celebration of everything that's important to him. Being kind, being generous, being around family and showing your love for them, and also your faith. So these Christmas decorations are there as well, and again are really closely linked with everything that is admirable about Tiny Tim's character. Bob then goes back downstairs and he feels more comforted having been upstairs and speaking with Tim and sort of having that moment to grieve privately. And he starts to tell a story of bumping into Mr. Scrooge's nephew, who's obviously Fred. And Fred has noticed from just seeing Bob that something is very wrong. And Bob is quite careful to say, "Oh, I looked just a little down, you know." But we think it must be something quite obvious for Fred, who doesn't know Bob very well, to pick up on this, to notice his emotional state. So we can imagine that Bob looks really more than a little down. So Fred stops to speak to him. And Dickens portrays how kind Fred is to Bob. Despite having only met him once or twice, he's really thoughtful and compassionate when he notices Bob's sadness. And Dickens illustrates how easy it is to be kind. Fred isn't a close friend of Bob's, they don't really know each other, but Fred's kindness makes a dramatic impact on Bob, who's obviously struggling and suffering in his grief. He really makes a point of noticing what a good person Fred is and how comforted he was by Fred's kindness as they talk about what has happened. So Fred gives his condolences to Bob Cratchit. He says he's very sorry for what has happened to Tiny Tim and to pass on his condolences, his sympathies to Mrs. Cratchit as well. And Bob emphasises that it's not because of anything that Fred can do to help the Cratchit family, although Fred has offered to help them, but what was really more important was just the kindness with which he was talking to him, and that's what made this so delightful and so pleasing and so comforting to him. And Bob says it really seemed as if he'd known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. So Dickens here illustrates the way in which Tim's influence seems to spread to anyone who's known him. Even Fred, who's never met Tim, seems in some way to have been affected by his death. He's sympathetic towards the Cratchit family for what they've been through. And this reminds us a little bit, or hopefully it reminds you, of Scrooge's thoughts earlier on in the Stave when he looks upon his own deathbed, although of course he doesn't know it's his. He reflects upon the fact that if you have been a good person in your life, your goodness outlasts you. Your influence and your memory carries on after you have died. And that goodness is something that exists even after you're gone. And this certainly seems to be true of Tiny Tim. His kindness and his goodness is continued in his family, and then it spreads to other people who are connected to the Cratchits, like Fred, who seems to have also been in some distant way affected by Tim's death. So again, it emphasises how that kindness can spread, that good influence can spread throughout a community. Just as Scrooge's unpleasant and negative atmosphere seems almost, almost contagious, so can goodness be. Okay, so they then talk a little bit about the future. Bob suggests that perhaps Fred might be able to get his son Peter a better job, and Peter is being teased then by one of his sisters because she's suggesting he's going to go off and get married and have a family of his own. And Bob says that is likely to happen at some point, but emphasises that none of them will ever forget poor Tiny Tim. So Tim's death is presented as this unforgettable tragedy for the family, and as they discuss their futures, Bob is reminding them Tim's memory will always be with them. So the family are going to be forever affected by this loss, forever changed by what has happened. And as they all promise that they will never forget Tiny Tim and how important he was in their lives, the family are united in this very sort of beautiful celebration of Tim's life. I'll just read this out because I can see it's just been cut off slightly there at the bottom. So as the Cratchit family reflect on Tim's life, and Bob says how patient and how mild he was, the family are united in their grief, but also in their love for one another. Dickens concludes this solemn scene by expressing that Tim's childish essence was from God. So again, Tiny Tim is being presented as an almost angelic figure. Now, Dickens is using Tim's untimely death for a purpose. He's using it to critique, that is, to criticise, the indifference of some of the wealthy middle classes to the struggles of the poor. So again, Dickens there is talking about the ignorance and the indifference, how the wealthy ignore the suffering of the poor. If the Cratchits were not so poor, it is implied Tim would not have died. If his family were more stable and were better able to look after him, if they were wealthier, he would still be with them. So Dickens uses this scene to emphasise the consequences of ignorance and indifference by highlighting how it causes the most vulnerable in society, symbolised by Tim, to suffer. So if Scrooge were a little less ignorant, if he were a little less indifferent, that is, if he were kinder and more generous, he would be able to protect someone like Tiny Tim and prevent him from suffering. Alright, that's the end of this scene from Stave 4. In the next scene, we will look at Scrooge discovering who the dead man is that he's been hearing about for so much of this stave, and we'll see the moment where he finally begs to be saved. Okay, I hope that that's been useful, and I will see you next time. Thank you.